My name's Ashlyn McGee. I'm a reporter at 7:30 on the ABC and the president of the Melbourne Press Club. And I'm so intimidated to be sharing the stage with you.
Oh, no, you're not.
I feel like we should introduce you, but you are also the lady in TV land who needs no introduction. And every time I think I have her CV nailed, someone else tells me something else that she's done. So Anita, thank you so much for being here at the Melbourne Press Club. You of course have this wonderful career that spans the really hands-on dirty work of producing some of Australia's most recognisable television shows. You've worked in management across so many of the big production companies and shows, and now you're in this lovely advisory capacity right across the industry. And particularly for the ABC, but also with ACMA. So you've got this lovely...
I'm not sure that anybody who knows ACMA would think I'm in an advisory capacity when it comes to broadcast investigations, especially not Kyle Sandilands, who needs to watch out.
Well, I'm sure you have some advice for him. But we're here to talk about your book, and I'm very excited to have you here, so welcome.
Thanks, Ash.
Can we start a little bit before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the book? I wanted to talk to you about the moment that you realised TV was your passion. What was it that made you go, this is the industry I want to be in?
I think I've always been interested in storytelling, and I also grew up in a family where my father was at the forefront of communications in Australia, though I never really recognised when he was alive how influential he was to my career. And I think probably... actually, when I was working, I wanted to be a journalist from the age of 15, but I would watch big news stories and I would always want to be able to get out there and tell the stories that we actually didn't know rather than the stories that we were being seen. And I've had such a curious mind that I've always been driven to do that. And I've always, even today, I will look at a story and think laterally about how you could tell that story as opposed to how it is being told. And I think that's been at the forefront of how I grew up with a father who always questioned everything that he heard. He came out of Nazi Germany, and so he'd really experienced a tough time. So he inculcated in me and in my other members of my family to be very questioning about things, not just to accept things on face value. And I think that's the heart of journalism, isn't it? It's about being courageous, it's coming up with ideas, it's thinking laterally about how you might do an idea, and then telling those stories that people really need to know about, that they don't know about. And to be honest, today I don't think there are enough good investigative journalists out there. I mean, Four Corners and 7:30 and 60 Minutes, you know, obviously with what Nick McKenzie is particularly doing at 9, but there aren't a lot of them because there's not the impetus to tell us the stories we need to know more broadly. And I think that's a great shame.
The industry has changed a lot since you first started. I think to say it was a boys' club is probably the understatement of the year. Tell us what it was like.
Well, I know that, you know, Hugh and Kate are here from 9 today, and probably some other people. Obviously, Margie worked at 9 for a while. When I started out, there were no senior women in any roles that you could look up to. We had no female role models. I actually started at the Women's Weekly, where Ita was my first female boss, and she was my only female boss for many, many years.
What was she like?
Pretty intimidating. And in fact, I can tell you here, I don't know those who watch Paper Giants with Ita, you know, the whole story of Ita that was on the ABC. There was one scene where you see Ita in pants, and I thought that's just crap, because when I was working with Ita at the Women's Weekly, we all had to go and buy dresses. Nobody ever wore pants, and I actually said that to Ita not so long ago, that it was wrong, and she said, I know. I know. I cringed when I saw myself in pants. That's not the way she was. But she was a really wonderful role model, and I think women need other role models just as men need role models. And when I worked, particularly at 9, I found it very tough. I worked on the Today Show, which people know. Margie was the Melbourne producer there, and I went in there as the 2IC, the second in charge at the Today Show. And not once, not twice, but 3 times I was passed over to be the executive producer, even though I was doing exactly the same job as the men. And Liz Hayes, who was then the host, went in and talked to the then head of news and current affairs. But Nine in those days didn't have any women. They didn't have any women, well, they had women, I beg your pardon, but they weren't running any programs. And I'm just talking commercial television because I think the ABC was quite different. So, in fact, after the 3rd time I went and saw a man called Ian Frickberg, the old head of News and Current Affairs, and he said, look, you know, I can't offer you a job. And I said, well, in that case, I'm resigning if I can't become executive producer. And not 2 days later, he offered me a consolation prize as a role on 60 Minutes, which was the program. I mean, 60 Minutes in those days on a Sunday night at 7:30, every week at 7:30, was the show to work on. But I was one of 2 women out of maybe, I think, 12 male producers.
You were telling me a little bit before about the Christopher Skase interview. Can we jump into that?
Yeah, I think everybody will recall Christopher Skase, and he was certainly in my day. He was the holy grail of journalism. If you could deliver an interview with Christopher Skase, you were really kind of achieving something. And I was working with John Laws in those days, and John was, like, in those days, the biggest broadcaster in Australia. And so what I did was I asked John to write Christopher Skase a letter. And Skase's father used to be a radio announcer down here in Melbourne at 3DB in Melbourne. And I think Skase receiving, when he was over in Spain, receiving a letter from John Laws about whether we could jump on a plane and go and interview him, was pretty intriguing and enticing. We happened to be shooting in London a number of interviews with people like Princess Diana's brother and Dame Helen Mirren and all these incredible interviews. And all of a sudden I got a call that Skase would do an interview with us in Mallorca, in his compound in La Noria. So my big dilemma was, it was the height of summer in London and I couldn't get a flight for John and myself to get over there. I could get the crew onto a flight, but the only flight I could get was on Ibiza Air, and I don't know if any of you know, that is the cheapest airline in the world. And John only flies first class, 1A.
I didn't even have a first class.
No. So I got these tickets, and in those days John was like 6'4", and we get into this very tiny plane with about, well, not tiny, but there were 6 rows. And of course he was only in economy, and he was, I could tell he was getting very angry that I was dragging him over to do this interview with Skase. But there was a moment where he put his arm down on the armrest and it broke. And I could see him getting more and more agitated, and there was nothing I could do. And I got over the flight steward, and they put some duct tape round and fixed it, which was not going to serve any purpose whatsoever. And John was getting more and more angry, and then they turned up with a popper, one of those popper drinks and a little wafer biscuit, and John was getting more. And I just started laughing because there was nothing. In fact, I almost wet myself because there was just nothing I could do. And luckily, he has a great sense of humour, and he started laughing. Okay, so we got to Spain and we landed an exclusive interview with Skase. Now, Sue Smethurst, who happens to be sitting up the back here, did the print interview for, was it Women's Day? I think it was? New Idea, I beg your pardon. And so we landed what was then a world exclusive with Christopher Skase. We spent a day with him in his compound in La Noria, and it was extraordinary. And John Laws is an extremely good interviewer. You mightn't put him on a pedestal now, but he, in his day, knew how to ask an interview. And at one point, he actually asked Skase to show us the evidence to show us that he had a problem with his emphysema. And sure enough, Skase very gently opened up the buttons on his shirt and showed us a scar from the bottom of here right down, which clearly showed that he did have a real issue. So it was an amazing moment in television. But I think what I was saying to Ash was, after he passed away, and we spent quite a bit of time with him, I don't know how many of you recall that his death happened very suddenly. No cause of death was given, and he was cremated. And John and I actually had surmised, and I think rightly, because he had lesions all over his arm, that he might well have died from AIDS.
When you talk about landing an interview like that. It makes for a cracking good story. But I imagine at the time that there would have been nerves and excitement, and you would have been worried about certain aspects of would it fall through. Where do you think you get your confidence from to really make it in that world?
I think you have to. I think confidence is really important because it radiates out of you. It's same as when you're running a production company or any production or any company. If you're not confident, then those people that are working around you won't be either. So I think I've learned that through having a very strong father figure, and I think daughters particularly are very influenced by fathers. I mean, they're also influenced by mothers, don't get me wrong. But if you've got a very confident father who instills in you the capacity to believe that anything is possible, then that's a real gift. And I think we downplay what parents actually instill in children, and I know from our work in Headspace and others how important that relationship is. So I think that's where it comes from. It doesn't mean that you're not confident in certain situations, but you don't allow it to get the better of you.
You paint this beautiful picture of your father in the book, and there are beautiful pictures in there, but I also feel like I can imagine being in that room with you where you're in his study and it's walls lined with books and he's smoking his pipe and German philosophers are on the wall. And so I feel like I was in there with you. But tell us a little bit about your father and why you decided to go down this path of investigating your own story.
Well, as I said, I think parents are so influential with children. And he was somebody that I adored, and I thought I knew everything about him. And then a number of years ago, I was at a dinner party in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and it was full of lawyers and journalists, and we were talking about a triple murder case that Australian Story was doing a two-parter with. And then all of a sudden there was a pause in this very, boisterous conversation, and a barrister looked at me and he said, "Do you know about the court case from the 1950s involving your father, this infamous case?" And both as a daughter and as a journalist, I had no idea what he was talking about. And you can imagine if you've told stories all your life and you've been inspired to tell stories all your life, and suddenly somebody's saying something about somebody that you adore and still adore, even though they've long gone. And then it became my life mission to find out as much as I could about what was this court case. And that led me through an incredible 9 years of research, of writing, of discovering material that I never knew existed. And I'm sure if all of you started digging around and asking within families, there's a reason why SBS did a very successful series, Every Family Has a Secret, because every family does have a secret. You've just got to be curious and want to know.
Having done it and discovering what you did, would you recommend it? Yeah, look, it's hard for me. I don't want to do a deep dive into my father because there are so many twists and turns from, being jailed by the Nazis, from fleeing Nazi Germany, from coming out to Australia and discovering how racist Australians are, and to be honest, are still pretty racist today, to being interned, to having a tumultuous love life that was just extraordinary and losing people in the most awful of circumstances. But he also was a political refugee stroke migrant who created great success, and we don't celebrate our refugees and our migrants nearly as much as I think we should. And so, yes, I think his story is an important story because it speaks to who and what we are. And it speaks to actually people coming from really behind the eight ball and creating great success. Not just, I don't mean in a financial sense, I mean that in a really deep sense, that he actually contributed to Australia in a way that perhaps a lot of people don't. How was it when you're used to doing this in a work context to suddenly turn that lens on yourself? How easy or difficult was that? Was it an enjoyable process?
Well, I was talking to Lisa Miller about this earlier because I read Lisa's book and I read your intro, and you talked about how difficult it was to write about your father, but then to write about yourself and weave your own story in. it is so difficult as a journalist because you're all about telling everybody else's story. You're all about being that at an emotional distance, telling somebody's story. Doesn't mean that you don't get emotionally involved with a story, although to a degree you've got to be careful with that. But I found it really tough. And in fact, it took me 9 years to do this. Because I wrestled for the first 7 years with injecting any of me into the book. But in order to have a voice in the story, you've got to be a character in that story as well, is where I really landed. I found it very difficult because I'm all about everybody else's truth. You know, the notion of a journalist is finding out somebody else's truth, not your own truth.
As part of the research, you uncovered all of these documents from an old court case and the archives and all over the place. And I just wonder, when these documents came back, did you have the aha moment because you're a journalist, or did you have a different feeling because it was your father?
I think I had a combination of the daughter and the journalist. Always that internal wrestle of the daughter wanting to do her father justice, and the journalist wanting to find out as much as they could, because I'm all about truth and getting to the bottom of something. And so you have that internal wrestle. But what I would say is there is so much material on the public record that probably people don't recognise, because what I had to do was I was just starting a big job running ITV studios. So I brought in an ex-Four Corners producer to help me research it. Well, she went on the public records. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages in my father's words on the public record because he'd been interned and because he'd been questioned by authorities so often, that I learnt so much about his past through his own words and the words of his mother and father, because they were also interrogated. And they gave a voice to grandparents I never knew at all. So there's something about reading about the words of your father and then your grandparents that you've never known in their own words, and the beautiful way that they spoke, even though they were, born and bred in Germany, yet their English was perfect. It was quite remarkable. It was so special. I mean, it really was. The tough part was when we found the court case, which took 3 years of digging, and it was found in a repository in Sydney where they keep all the government documents. And I never thought that they would keep this original court case, which was about 600 pages long. And so this is to do with my father's third wife. It was a terrible marriage. She was a shocker, and she was an alcoholic, and she tried to sue him for what's called constructive desertion, and then it morphed into an adultery case where you used to have divorce raids where you'd have to catch somebody in the act. That's how you got out of a marriage in those days. So in 600 pages, I'm reading this corrosive marriage that's like War of the Roses, or, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, in my father's words, and in her words, and so there's something quite surreal about doing that.
And if you're wondering why we're not talking about the exact story in a very linear way, it's because it is such a fascinating and detailed story, and Anita does have copies of her book here at the back, and I can't recommend it to you enough.
Oh, thanks, Ash.
But I think you get enough of the hints about what it contains. The former prime ministers, there's spies, there's salacious court cases, there's layers upon layers upon layers, and it's also the story of Australia and a migrant story as well as Anita's story today.
Can I just say, what I've really I guess I reflected on myself is I hadn't really thought, because both of my parents fled persecution. My mother was born in Harbin in northern China in Manchuria. Well, she was born at a time that the Japanese had invaded Harbin, and she was a white Russian, and the Japanese had set up this torture camp right in Harbin where they were abducting people as they were walking along off the streets. My mother and her family had to flee Harbin to get they chose Australia. Again, they chose the furthest country away from where they were. And I don't think we recognise, today it really irks me that I hadn't really thought about how tough it was for them both to come to a new country, leaving everything behind and set up a new life with nothing. And I think that's a reality for so many people who are still coming to Australia today. So that's been a real eye-opener as a journalist, that I was so ignorant about that.
What was it like finding out so many details about your father and his life and knowing that you couldn't just go to him and ask him about it, that he wasn't there? Did you feel him still there?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things I've wrestled with, because it's one thing to find out this extraordinary story. And look, I've told hundreds of stories all over the world, you know, everything from Clinton to, you know, Sir David Attenborough to Jane Fonda to you name them. And when you find the richest story of your life in your own family and you then can't have any conversations with somebody because they passed away 25 years ago, that's really hard, you know, because I've got so many questions. And this is with a relationship with somebody that I really adored and still adore today. It doesn't change my nature. I just see him as a much more complex and flawed individual, like we all are. It's not something that you see often in your parents. You put them on a pedestal and you go through life and you don't really know their stories at all.
Was there a point you wanted to walk away?
No. No, and my other half, John, will tell you that I kept going and going and going, and it's not an autobiography. I mean, I leave a lot of my story out of there because, for lots of reasons, but I do cherry pick some of my stories so that there are some stories that I weave in there that are fascinating about the industry, because the industry's changed so much, and I think it's really, to position where women are today in our industry, I think also is really important.
It takes us nicely to where we want to go next, which is what you're seeing out there at the moment, and having had this incredible career, casting your eye over what's on our screens at the moment. What are the things that you're loving about Australian TV right now, and what are the things that you go, oh, not so great?
Is this in the cone?
You tell me.
I'm no fan of reality television, because to me it's constructed reality, and I think there are even producers called Franken producers, which kind of construct the narrative of what you think is reality television, but it's actually constructed. I yearn for more. I yearn for more current affairs. I yearn for more news. I yearn for more documentary. We have hardly got any documentary on Australian television anymore. And I sit on the ACMA, and I know, you know, the networks obviously see it's, you know, more economic to put their money into strip reality. I understand that. I understand the, you know, the constraints of the economics of our industry. But I think there are whole audiences that are missing out on the kind of content that they should be watching and consuming, and I think it affects the way we perceive everything. And I think that's a great shame. So I watch a lot of streaming. I love, you know, some of the shows there. But there's also a darkness about a lot of the shows that you get on the streaming networks. I don't know if other people feel it. There's not a lot of light and joy in what you're watching. And I think people want a sense of optimism, and they want to feel good about themselves and empowered. And a lot of content is not about that. It's not about that kind of storytelling. And at 60 Minutes, I would tell stories that were tough investigative stories or hard stories, but I'd also look for stories that had lightness in them, because I think that's what people want. They need some levity in their lives.
So in a time where commercial networks and the ABC are struggling to do that, what is a solution, any solution?
Can I suggest that we have more original content rather than rip off of other ideas? When Andrew Denton and I had our production company, in 1 year we had 7 original shows on air. That was Enough Rope, that was The Gruen Transfer, that was Country Town Rescue, that was Hungry Beast. Those were original ideas, homegrown ideas that audiences loved because they could relate to them. They didn't need all these international formats brought in here. And I think you have to be brave and take that risk, and I'm not sure that programmers today are brave. Because, again, I guess because of the economic constraints. But really, you know, people, like, I watched The Gruen Transfer. It's a terrific show, don't get me wrong. But 14 years, how about we try something new? I think it's important. Innovation in content and storytelling is really important.
I'll ask you specifically about the ABC and its approach to taking risk, just because there traditionally has been more of an appetite and more of a mandate to try things out. And keeping in mind your position as the chair of the ABC Advisory Council, is the ABC taking anywhere near enough risk at the moment with its non-fiction storytelling?
I don't think so. But then it's also driven by ideas. So I don't know the kind of ideas that are being generated within the ABC, and I don't know the kind of ideas that are being pitched to the ABC. But I mean, I'd love to see the next iteration of The Chaser. I mean, I feel like and I love The Chaser again, but who are the next generation of The Chaser coming through? There should be, when we did Hungry Beast, I don't know how many of you remember the show Hungry Beast, what it did was we actually went out, it was based on This Day Tonight, we went out and we found 19 young broadcasters, we gave them 4 months of training within the ABC. They are now senior broadcasters, they're everybody from Dan Illich to Mark Fennell, to Ali Russell who's now on Four Corners. We've created a hotbed of industry professionals, and the guy who created You Can't Ask That came out of Hungry Beast, Kirk Docker. The guy who shot that, Aaron Smith, who's one of the best cinema DOPs in Australia, came out of Hungry Beast. That's what the ABC should be doing, creating new talent.
I'll take you just back to where we started and talking about how sexist the industry was when you started. You're also chair, am I right in saying chair of Women in Media, a big champion of the Women in Media organisation, and Women in Media has just conducted some research. What does that say about where we're at the moment, how much things have changed or how much they haven't?
So it's interesting, Women in Media is like the peak body for Women in Media, and we've got over 6,000 members Australia-wide, and if you don't belong, please join if it interests you. And so we did some research that came out about 2 weeks ago, and basically the average disparity in gender pay in Australia is about 13%. But in Women in Media, it sits above 16%. So there is a disparity there. And so we are calling on a gender pay audit so that there's actual equity, there's equity there. And what we had is 84% of our members felt that it was either weak or, what was that? Sorry, I'm just going to refer to my notes so I'm not kind of saying the wrong thing here. But 84% of respondents called for a gender pay audit to be introduced because they felt that that was important. And more than 1 in 2 women, of those women that we surveyed, rated the industry's commitment to gender equality as either weak or somewhat weak. So I think our industry, considering we're the arbiters and we disseminate news and information out to the wider community, and yet we're actually not tackling this problem as much as we should, is I think something that we should do. And I think it's important for us to keep raising that profile and to get some of the employers recognising it across the media industry. And I'm not singling out any particular media industry, I just think it should be the norm.
We'll throw the floor open to some questions now. If you will raise your hands with any questions. Don't be shy. One over here.
Sorry, I'll just give you that mic.
Okay. When did you decide that you were going to explore this story, obviously, from the beginning, but when did you decide this is a book?
So what happened was after I heard about the court case and I started, what I didn't say about this court case was, what particularly intrigued me was it involved my father's third wife and a man that she was having an affair with who was called Laurie Morgan. Now, you probably don't know Laurie Morgan, but he's one of the most famous Victorian sportsmen ever. He won double gold at the Rome Olympics in horse riding, won more than Dawn Fraser and Murray Rose. He was your leading badminton player. He played Fitzroy. He was a leading athlete across so many codes, but he was an absolute rogue. And I heard about him, and then I heard that he had actually somehow got connected with the Queen and was giving horses to the Queen. And somehow I thought, how's my father connected with Laurie Morgan? So I became completely fascinated in this case. And originally it was a family history. And then the more we dug, and there were ASIO files, there was an ASIO file on my father. He was at the peak of the Cold War. There was a spying incident that he was involved with. the more we dug, the more story that I found, the more I wrestled as a daughter and a journalist about, do I just make this for the family or do I make this as... And I just recognised it was a really big story and an important Australian story. And I interviewed people like John Howard, the former Prime Minister, who was my father's commercial lawyer, Dick Smith, who my father gave his first job to, Carla Zampatti, who my father mentored. And so I realised that it was a story that I needed to tell more publicly and more widely. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll know later on. But
I'm noticing the expressions from the audience here that you might have missed as you drop all these little scaricks. I tell you, this book has everything and everyone.
It's just like
joking.
The way that my life has intersected with all of these people has been quite remarkable. And I interviewed Carla not long before she passed away. That was a real privilege for me to go and sit there and talk to her. And she's talking to me about my father and about the notion of migrants and how important they are and how my father influenced her so much. And, you know, that makes you feel really proud. Better that he influenced her in that way. So
Lucy's next. She had one of those faces.
I did have one of those faces. Firstly, Ashlyn and Anita, fantastic conversation. I've loved it. Thank you so much. Anita, digging into family history can be quite difficult, and obviously it was something you wanted to pursue. Did you face any opposition from other people within your family who may not have wanted you to dig that far?
Look, thank you. I raised it with my family, every member of my family, as soon as I felt like I was actually starting to encroach on territory I shouldn't go to. And I've got to say, if you read the book, I have a half-sister, and her mother died in very, very tragic circumstances. And I spoke to her from day one about needing to write about this story because her mother was my father's second wife. And I have brought her along the journey every step of the way. And do you know what? It's actually been really cathartic for her because suicide, and this is what it's about, is an issue that I believe should be talked about. And too often, I know there's some people in the room who might feel similar to me, too often we don't talk about this issue. And on many occasions I've gone to tell stories, and in those days we weren't really allowed to talk about it being suicide. Whereas, not that you talk about the mode that somebody uses and do a deep dive into that, but I think you need to face the reality that this is a real issue. So I talked to my sister at length about actually writing about her mother and what happened, which is all on the public record. And she, you know, I bought her, and if she'd said to me no, I wouldn't have done it. But in fact, it's made our relationship much closer because I lived for many years knowing something had happened to my sister's mother, but never having a conversation with her about it. Because how do you say that? How do you raise with your sister or my half-sister, I'm really sorry to hear that your mother died? It's that family don't do that.
Did it almost give you the cover to have all of those conversations?
It does. That's exactly what it does. And in fact, it's made my relationship with her so much closer because I understand her now. I didn't, none of us understand where mental health is involved, how that impacts on people and how that then has that ripple effect on families, which is, in her case, exactly what happened. But now I've got great empathy and tolerance is the wrong word, empathy and understanding of what she went through and what she still goes through to this day. And she's in her 70s.
If we have any other... Oh, we've got one from Anne and Hugh. Yep. You can... Anne's jumping in first.
Thank you. Just to pick up on what you're talking about, mental health. And before I do the pick up, Lucy, I completely agree. Wonderful conversation. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for your time today. But when you're talking about mental health, you raised before Headspace. So is that something that's motivated you to be involved with Headspace? And how are you finding... And sorry to ask a double-edged question, but Headspace at the moment, any mental health provider, they're having a hard time getting the support that they need. So what are your comments about that and how do we address that?
Oh, gee, I'm probably least qualified. when I'm sitting here with Patrick and Barb and Michael and Chris. Look, yes, we were involved with Headspace, and I sat on the board for 3 years. And but we would have really robust discussions about how to raise the issue of youth, particularly youth mental health was really our bailiwick. Simone was involved, so that was all about raising the profile of these issues. But I haven't been involved since about 2016. Patrick and Barb would be much more capable. I just think it's so important to have this issue on the national agenda. And I'm pleased to see that I think through COVID, there has been an injection of more money into Headspace centres. It's just vital. I mean, our young people are everything. And it frustrates me that, I live out in Avalon in New South Wales. We've got one of the highest rates of suicide on the Northern Peninsula. And it just disgusts me that we can't seem to address that issue at all and give kids a sense of being and self-worth. But I've also got this thing about the internet and social media. And whilst I just think it's probably been one of the worst things that could have been introduced into our society, because it alienates people. Everybody's your friend, but they're not your friend. The stuff that happens on social media, the bullying, the poisonousness, you can understand why this kind of stuff happens. But I'm no expert in this area. I'm a storyteller. But I do know that, with Patrick, we told a very good documentary, Angels and Demons, for the ABC. Well, I think that led to a week of programming on youth mental health that the ABC did as a big issue. Because there are big issues that you can really galvanise across programs, whether it's Q&A, 7:30, the special that you did, which are really important. And I think we need to do more of those big conversations. And I think that's a really good area for the ABC to keep doing.
Hugh, you had a question?
A bit of a gear change. The TV and film rights for Secrets Beyond the Screen. Stan, Netflix, the bidders, there'll be plenty of them. And any casting thoughts on your old man? And also, who's going to play Anita Jacoby?
Oh, Hugh, do you know what? I've got no idea. Look, I've often thought, because he looked a bit like Errol Flynn, or I don't know. I can't think of a contemporary actor. I just don't know about me. But it's funny, Caroline Jones, the dearly loved Caroline Jones, she read it. I sent it to her, and actually I felt terrible about it, I should say, because I didn't realise that her mother had suicided. And she's quite open about that. She'd written a book about it, and she wrote back and she said, this is a film. And she, which was lovely of her. So I don't know, Hugh. I just don't know. It's such a. You need the book. You almost need a whiteboard to kind of describe all the twists and turns in it. And I'm really skating over it. So I'm not trying to shirk it, but I just really don't know.
Hot tip for the production company: no pantsuits at the Women's Weekly.
No, that's right.
Part of the story.
Yeah.
Have you been approached at all?
Look, yes, somebody's mentioned it to me. I haven't really I don't know if anything will happen. It's too premature. And really, I didn't write it to be I wrote it because I thought it was an important story to tell. And also I wanted to celebrate my dad. It's not often you can celebrate a parent so publicly with all their warts and all. And I've often wondered what he would think about me writing this, because maybe he didn't want his life out there. But maybe he did.
Hi, Anita, it's Celia Hirsch, former employee of the Nine Network a long time ago in the newsroom. I always was curious about finding out stories, but I wanted to be a reporter. As a producer, how difficult or easy was it to be behind the scenes when, your Richard Carltons and your Liz Hayes and everyone else are taking the glory for the stories that you've ostensibly done?
Well, sometimes it could be really tough because you'd put in a lot of the hard yards to get that story. And I'm thinking of one, and I won't tell you the name of the reporter, but I set out to tell a story on binge drinking, teenage binge drinking, many years ago before people were really doing that story, and it was for 60 Minutes. And I had spent a long time talking to a single mum who had 4 kids, but her daughter, her 15-year-old daughter, was a complete renegade. And I had asked, could we film with her family? Could we film with her daughter? And I was being very gentle about it. And what happened during the interview was that the reporter actually started having a go at this woman because she couldn't discipline her children. That's how it came across. And this woman was a single mum of 4 kids. Her husband or partner had walked out on her a long time ago. She was in a terrible situation living in a housing commission place. So to have the reporter turn around and start lecturing her on not being able to manage her children, I actually had such a go at her afterwards. So, but on the other hand, you see your work come to life, and they can value add a lot to what you've thought of in terms of storytelling. So I worked with Richard Carlton on a number of stories, and I've got to say he was quite intimidating for a young woman. But I did a story with a dole bludger called Randy Savage over in Western Australia, who was one of my first stories. And Randy had been on the dole for 16 years, and I approached him and said, well, can we set out to get you a job? And Randy was like, yeah, it was the best television. And Richard was the best reporter, because he'd go in there and he'd do a really, interesting, like he was a great interviewer. Admittedly, on Randy, he asked the wrong question or two, but you'll have to read the book to find out what happened. But he was a magnificent reporter.
Well, I've read the book. I can't recommend it enough. I'm going to ask our CEO, Kathy Bryson, to give us a vote of thanks. But my personal thank you
Ash,
for sharing this story with us and for being here today.
Thank you.
Being so open. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks, Kathy.